It's time to be consumed by the violet in E2M06 Organism. After the previous one was a step in the right direction, it honestly feels like this map backpedals hard. Under attack from the beginning, and most of it is just a big purple maze with mutants all over the place, which frankly feels like the worst of what you've seen in the previous maps of Episode 2. At least it has an arguably more forgiving key trap with Super Smurfs instead who won't fire straight away, so at least you can deal with them a little better. The blue room leading into the exit is likewise not bad, but I guess dominantly purple maps have to have a fake exit full of enemies, and this one is worse because it's full of mutants. Ultimately, it's like the worst of Episode 2 mixed with the worst easily lost in purple elements of Violent Nightmare, and at least that map had the good grace of being an optional secret map. It's time to face the power of water in E2M10 Sapphire Specimen. If you didn't like the mutants in the first map, you may as well not bother going for this one because it's absolutely smothered with them. At first glance, the map seems extremely small with just one starting room, one exit room, and one hallway, but that's just because the overwhelming majority is behind secret push walls. The one nice thing is that among the flood of mutants, at least there's some guards and super smurfs for some desperately needed sense of variety. When I was going through the long halls of treasure and dreaded what was about to become, I was actually relieved when I saw it was just Super Smurfs waiting at the end. While it's cool that the ceiling color is different, the map has way too many cheap shot moments and obscure hidden things for comfort, leading to an overall weak-feeling map. It's time to face the purple madness in E1M10 Violent Nightmare. I give it that name because the map pretty uniquely is covered in purple walls, which feels very different. It's also technically the first map to introduce the double S, but they're wearing blue, so I just cheekily call them Super Smurfs. Perhaps in part because of all the purple, I find it really easy to get lost in this map, even with EC Wolf's auto map. The map also gets weirdly a bit spammy with those Smurfs at the end, especially a fake exit full of them. It's time to enjoy some sugar water in E2M04 Pesky Placebo. The way this map starts really lives up to its track name of Pounding Headache because it starts out with mutants facing you. Somehow they took the mutant trap from the previous map and made it much more annoying with them behind doors and can hear you, making it more feasible to just grab the key and run for some actual cover. Probably the most memorable part is the door leading to a brick wall, which was admittedly slightly amusing. Aesthetically, it's more mostly slime walls with just one section into the exit with wood and the aforementioned brick wall to provide any kind of visual variety unless you count non-slime walls for the key trap. Ultimately, I think it mostly combines the worst aspects of the mandatory Episode 2 map so far, and for the most part, I wanted to just get it over with. It's time to get our digits way too filthy in E1M9, hands gross! I hate to say it, but from a gameplay perspective, this might be the most dull and simplistic boss map I've ever seen, even lacking some of the added depth that the Doom 2 homage would later give to it. It has a decent amount of flair, mind you, and Blazkowicz raising his arms in victory in the ending cutscene is just really cool for 1992 standards. I don't want to hate on this map, but I have to be honest and say the actual substance of this map is very, very small. Not only that, but the main boss is rapid-fire hit-scan bullet sponge like the Spider Mastermind from Doom, which is my least favorite boss from that game. With Hans, though, he's also just really easy to take down if you make any kind of use of cover, so I wouldn't even really call it challenging. The visual flair is the only positive thing I have to say about this map, to be honest. Watch out for Donkey Kong in E1M05 Barrels of Blitz. To the map's credit, it starts out surrounded by doors, so it's very centric for exploration from the start. It continues Wolfenstein 3D's maps being very strong in that regard, giving you plenty of spaces to poke around in. However, in this particular map's case, I feel it's relatively weak because it relies too much on ambush encounters. What I mean by that is there will be soldiers at walls right past the door, making it very hard to get to them before they get a point-blank shot on you, even when you see them coming. While this was obviously intended to create challenge, I just wasn't the biggest fan of that kind of tactic. It's still an alright map. I'm not going to say it's terrible just because of enemy ambushes, I just wouldn't really say it holds up to most of the other previous maps. It's time to get treated for E2M07 Infectious Iron. It seems it took a page from Sapphire Specimen's book, being a mandatory map with a good majority of it is behind secret push walls. 5 guards and 3 super smurfs are all the mandatory enemies you'll find, and that's on the hardest difficulty at that. Admittedly, when I was going for the optional content, one purple room swarming with mutants caused me to lose my temper, but you get 3 lives over it, so not a half bad deal. Other than the purple room, the map is pretty much just gray bricks, both the slime and non-slime variety, so it's pretty visually dull. Still, at least it doesn't infuriate me anywhere near as much as Sapphire Specimen did, the mandatory path not even having any mutants at all. Also helps that it's just one secret push wall to access the bulk of it instead of being split off into 3. It's time for some surgical precision in E2M09 Dr. Dismal. This map is sort of a wash because the design is drabby blue metal walls, but Shabs himself is a substantially more interesting boss than Hans Gross. He actually uses a projectile which encourages you to dodge, and there's a unique death animation if you fail to do so where Blazkowicz turns into a mutant. There's also mutants guarding him, so it has a bit more than Hans's boss map, though this can be bad or good depending on who you ask because mutants are annoying. It also introduces the kill cam, since unlike the previous map, this one ends when you kill the boss rather than reaching an exit. Ultimately, between style and substance, I have to place a greater importance on substance, so I'm going to say it's at least better than Hans Gross. This one feels like a bit of a step down, not because it's bad, but just because it's not as memorable. Unlike the previous maps, this one relies much more on gray bricks, though it has a bit of blue brick and wood for contrast. It's still a solid map, and I've honestly gained appreciation for the semi-linearity of these old maps. After playing through more than a few maps that give you no room for exploration, it's nice seeing a lot of side rooms and even more than one way to enter somewhere. Of course, that's been applying to all of these maps so far, but it's still very nice to have, and this is no exception. It's time to get wild changes in E2M1, Mine Mutant. This map only has one enemy, but it's a doozy, the silent and instant-to-fire mutants that are the bane of any Wolf 3D player's existence. The map itself is short but gets intense fast, giving you a machine gun and even having a chain gun and a pretty easy-to-find secret. Aesthetically, the map also introduces a form of gray wall with green slime oozing out of it, either from the mutant experiments or maybe this area has just fallen into disuse because the mutants are implied to be untamable. However, Jailbreak this isn't, since as menacing as the mutants are, it's still only one type of enemy throughout the entire map, and the map feels a little small, even with some optional rooms. I guess the idea is that it's more intense than beefy, with the room into the exit even having a few mutants just spammed out at you for cheap difficulty. It's time for Restlessness in E3M03 Koffein Coffin. It has a mandatory secret, which you'd think would make me rip it apart, but it was right behind a locked door and I found it in 2 seconds, so Spirit World, this is not. Honestly though, the map is just fairly forgettable apart from that, with officers being expected alongside the Super Smurfs, guards, and dogs. A single twisting wooden wall room is the only visual distinction in a sea of gray brick wall, making me question why so many maps choose to use such limited wall textures. Surely they could have added a few more wall textures or even just used more of what they already had between gray brick, slimy gray brick, blue brick, red brick, wood, and purple. Now that's not to say it's a bad map, but it does mean it's one of those maps that I'm probably not going to remember apart from technically having a mandatory secret. It's time to get lost in E3M07 Amazing Armeries! If you're hoping to get to the secret exit, I hope you're willing to go through one hell of a complex maze, but at least it's optional, so I'll sort of give it a pass. The map isn't exactly visually varied though, pretty much all wooden walls, which isn't much better than a map that has nothing but gray brick. Again, gameplay-wise, it's not exactly bad, but these maps, with the exception of the mutants, don't vary too drastically for gameplay, so being a sea of brown hurts it a bit. Well, at least it starts out with a unique kind of spiral that actually kind of reminds me of a map from Nightmare 3D, which has a similar block wall system. 10 officers here, so they haven't really increased, which is good because they aren't just spamming them like a lot of mutant maps tended to do. Ultimately, it's a decent map, but I feel it's a little too bland for comfort and blends in with the other maps. It's time to be hungry like the wolves in E2M08 Aardwolf Abomination. So this is the infamous Aardwolf map with a series of very specific push blocks to get to a signpost saying to call up Apogee. Other than that, the map's alright, but not really anything that special either from a gameplay perspective. It has some interesting attempts at rooms like a restroom and a storage area, so I'll give them credit for that. One thing I will say is a nice touch is there's very little of the gray bricks covered in slime, which makes sense because it's getting closer to Shabs' lab. I can't say if that was intentional, but it would make sense because it means these halls would be much less fallen to disuse and neglect. Ultimately, it's relatively inoffensive, which places it above certain other maps, and the Aardwolf secret was a neat idea at the time until data mining ruined it. It's time to get into the fight in E1M06 Brick and Mortar Fire. Visually, the map is certainly a breath of fresh air, with mainly red bricks and golden emblems to provide some visual flair. Of course, it's not only red bricks, it has some wooden areas and a light dash of gray to help break things up. The map has a fair amount of difficulty for this far into the episode, and the chain gun can get you out of the more crowded areas like one spot full of Super Smurfs. It's one of those maps that ultimately isn't going to blow you away with how memorable it is, but it doesn't overstay its welcome, and there's nothing egregious in it. It's a very solid middle-of-the-road map that does what it needs to do while having a nice overall visual presentation to it. It's time to get wet in a very bad way in E2M03 Subject Slime. This one's also pretty good for the most part. Visually, the slimy walls are repetitive, which is a shame given the previous map, but surprisingly it doesn't start out facing mutants. There's a kind of dull room that spams them out leading to a silver key in another room, but for the most part guards and Super Smurfs, which I'm grateful for. This also marks the first map to use both the gold and silver key, meaning the different colored doors actually matter in this one. Weirdly, among the sea of slimy brick walls, there's two one-block rooms of wood, almost like broom closets or confessionals or something. While the map isn't exactly the biggest looker aside from a few elements like the night sky pillars, at least from a gameplay perspective, it's very functional. It's time to get annoyed by the ranking system in E3M01 Officer Obnoxious. This map introduces the white-suited officer. Thankfully, one of them, and despite being quicker on the draw, isn't anywhere near as obnoxious as mutants, having an alert sound and still not being instant. Visually, the map's kind of dull with mostly gray brick with some wood and blue brick and a secret to provide any variation, which is kind of a shame in my opinion. At least the map is fine to actually play, though it's not afraid to make you fight to get your first machine gun, especially on the hardest difficulty. It has an alright length for a starter map and a locked door to make it into the exit, even if it's still not up to the level of Jailbreak. Given episode 2 started out exclusively spamming you with mutants, I appreciate the restraint of only including one officer, which feels so much less cheap. It's time to put a stamp on our chaos in E3M02 Officially Disorderly. This very much follows up on the previous map for better or worse, having two officers and a wooden wall in addition to another blue brick secret, but not really a big step forward. It's still a solid map, but it feels a bit on the forgettable side without much to make it stand out, with another fairly short loop to a key to exit. Honestly, it's difficult for me to find much to talk about except that it gives you the chain gun and a secret, which is pretty cool having this early on. It continues what I've come to expect from Wolfenstein 3D, where you get multiple choices of where to go and a healthy amount of optional areas, so at least that's nice to have. It's time to get cooked in E3M08 Out of the pan. As the penultimate map, not counting the prequels and expansions, this certainly doesn't go easy on you, especially on Death Incarnate. The horde to the exit in particular can be ruthless, practically requiring the chain gun and the use of cover to survive it. Visually, it's mostly gray brick, but it does have enough variation like steel pillars and red bricks and wood to keep from becoming visually repetitive. There isn't too much else to say about this map, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a tough map with some visual variety, and it doesn't need to so much rely on gimmicks, which is respectable for the second to the last of the original Wolf 3D maps. Eat all the cherries in sight as it's E3M10 Pac-Man Panic. Okay, I'll admit it, this map is just straight up pure fun. It's nonsensical, mostly just the map from Pac-Man with a ghost and some Wolfenstein enemies thrown in, but it was very entertaining. The ghosts are completely unkillable with the power pellets being replaced by life power-ups, but they move very slowly, so they're easy to avoid. It's actually kind of funny that you had to go through a very complex maze to get to this map that's also themed after a Pac-Man maze. The exit is two different halls that are covered in guards, so nothing super creative, but that's obviously not the focus here, so it gets a pass. I could point out things like the map's short or it only has one wall texture or what have you, but sometimes just being funny is enough to make you willing to overlook all of that. It's time to disassemble the establishment in E3M05 Disbricked. Well, at least they're actually making use of red bricks again, along with a single wooden wall room to help break up the now expected sea of gray brick. Weirdly though, the map feels cramped even if it's probably around the same size as other maps due to it all being on one side of the start and the other just being a narrow path to a dead end. Helping to that feeling is only two secrets, weirdly. In addition to just being visually varied though, it also has the tighter paths in that red brick area that I praised Blitzbrick for having. It contrasts nicely with the central pillar room that leads to the major rooms in the map. Ultimately, it's a pretty good map despite feeling a little short and makes good use of enemy placement, including the 13 officers. Hope you can keep your shape because it's time for E2M02 Melting Monstrosity. The best way I can describe this map is it's like a map from episode 1 got melted into a map from episode 2. It starts out full episode 2 with slime walls and mutants, but weirdly it shifts into more episode 1 territory with the expected bricks and wood and guards and super smurfs mixed in. To its credit, it's a lot less spammy with mutants than the previous 2 maps, opting instead to more hide them in places like behind corners or behind a pillar. The visual variety was also greatly appreciated since just slime-covered gray brick walls would have gotten old after a while. While I still wouldn't put it too high compared to episode 1, at least it feels like a step in the right direction and is gonna have room for more things than just throwing mutants everywhere. It's time to lose our minds in E3M03 Blitz Crazy! I'd say this one continues the trend upwards if nothing else, still not a drastic leap but ever so slightly more variety. Now it has probably as much blue bricks as gray bricks along with 2 connecting rooms of wooden walls and a third and a secret. The amount of officers has doubled to 4 and it's clear that they're at their most dangerous mixed into a crowd, but still substantially more fair than the mutants could ever be. Given how similar officers are to guards, this map overall feels like it would fit right in with episode 1, which is a compliment given I thought episode 1 had mostly the better maps, especially compared to episode 2. This may not be all that big a step forward, but it is definitely a step in the right direction in terms of quality. If the worst thing I can say about a map is it's good but not great, then I'd consider that a compliment compared to most. It's time to snore loudly in E1M07 Warsawed Wood. If you'll pardon the pun, this is another map that's as sturdy as wood. About the only oddity I found in the map is the 2 key doors that both lead to the exit have different colors but are both used by the same key, which is such a small thing. There's actually an interesting trap with pillars where soldiers could shoot you through them if you're not careful, which feels much more fair and interesting than cheaply shoving guards on walls right behind doors. It's not the most visually varied of the Wolf 3D maps, but it has a good enough mix of wood and gray brick so that it doesn't feel too repetitive and has nicely spacious halls. When you get down to it, this is one of those maps that may not completely blow your mind, but it's just reliably fun and has just enough guards so that you can't get complacent. It's time for some discipline in E3M06, Steal Thyself. I will admit I'm biased towards the red brick aesthetic because I consider a map full of that vastly superior to a map full of gray brick. That and some wood, a touch of blue brick, and a blue metal maze, and there's little to complain about visually. Interestingly, there's actually a secret that gets you straight to the silver key and either bypass the horde before it or giving you a chance to get the drop on them with their backs to you. I wasn't the biggest fan of the previously mentioned metal maze, but at least you mostly just have regular guards around corners instead of mutants, so it's far less egregious. Overall, I'd say it's a fairly mixed bag, with some aspects I enjoyed quite a bit and some maybe not so much. I'll give it credit for that. It's probably better to have high highs and relatively lower lows than to just be a shrug the whole way through. It's time to break bars in E1M01 Jailbreak. Disclaimer, these map names were made up by me since Wolf 3D doesn't actually have map names. I actually think it's a fairly good starter map, giving you some room for exploration and introducing the machine gun via secret, which is arguably the best all-around weapon. At 5 secrets, it has a decent amount for a starter map, even giving you access to the episode's secret map right from the get-go. It doesn't throw too much at you at once, guards and dogs provide a decent warm-up for what's to come. Overall, despite Wolf 3D's limitations, it manages to make a very solid starter map. Clearly it was considered iconic since it got a cameo in Doom 2. It must be getting chilly because it's E1M04 Feeling Blue. You can probably guess why I named it that, but it has a healthy amount of gray wall too, with a bit of red bricks for good measure. Even a very interesting shape with wood walls, which is funny because only through a modern source port can you actually take full notice of the shape. Overall, it's another very solid map for Wolf 3D's lineup, with increasing amount of enemies and also the first to have a chain gun outside of secret areas. There's also a good amount of optional areas to encourage exploration, in addition to several ways of entering rooms, both of which you know I greatly appreciate. It's also a map that somewhat takes advantage of back-facing guards, since you can get the surprise on some if you enter the right places. Overall, I wouldn't call it the best, but I would consider it a very good map in its own right. It's time to avoid impalement in E2M05 Hideous Hooks. Both visually and in enemies, this is easily the most varied I've seen in the episode so far. Every major type of wall, including a bit of purple, and every regular enemy type, including dogs, which I haven't seen in a good while. While it does still have its mutant spam here and there, it also feels very refreshing in how varied everything is, and another dual key map on top of that. The only real nitpick I can come up with is the slight repetition of it being long winding halls with smaller rooms, because it's clearly trying to be of a certain type of shape. Looking past that, there's enough optional areas and secrets to feel like a well-rounded map as a whole. Mutants will never truly be a fun enemy, but at least this map keeps them relatively on the down low, and I'd consider it the cream of the crop for episode 2 so far. It's time for an Ultra Bird in E1M02 Super Smurf U. You can tell this is the next mandatory map after the first because it feels like an evolution of that one. It also introduces Super Smurfs to anyone who didn't get the secret map. It also makes good use of gray brick, blue brick, and wood, and even attempts to make things like bathrooms for variety. It even introduces the big powerhouse of Wolf 3D, the chain gun, handy for dealing with a tough crowd even if it chews through ammo. As iconic as the starter map is, I can't deny that this map just makes it better in all aspects. It's time to speed the bricking in E1M01 Blitzbrick. It goes back to a primarily red brick design with some gray brick and wood added in there, which almost reminds me of the old 3D Maze screensaver on Windows with how tight it is. That's not a bad thing, of course. It has a good amount of detail density, like a couple of rooms devoted to just having dead prisoners in them. It also has a decent amount of optional content, with me getting to the exit relatively quickly but finding plenty of other things to do. The tighter rooms and halls may mean it's not as graphically impressive, but I think it actually works better to Wolfenstein 3D's strengths like this. It doesn't feel quite so stretched out in a lot of these areas, and there are rooms that are genuinely full of personality despite the 90-degree block limitation. Overall, it may not have the best moments in Wolfenstein 3D, but I'd say its consistency gives it a real edge. It's time to heat things up in E3M09 into the Fuhrer. This is undoubtedly the best of the boss maps, and not just because you're taking on old AH himself. Not only is there a bit more getting to him, but there's a unique enemy in the form of a fake that showers you with fireballs, albeit slow moving. AH himself is a little like Hans Gross, but with two phases, armored and unarmored. Armored, he has double the firepower at quad chain guns, and unarmored it's down to 2, but he's as fast as an officer. Even better, when you land the final blow, he satisfyingly melts into a pile of organs instead of just falling over unless you're playing the SNES version. There may not be too much to the map itself, but it has enough to be a good lead to him, and let's be real, taking down the infamous Fuhrer in a badass chain gun fight is just immensely satisfying. It's time to sum up this journey through the Wolf Castles with a Wolfenstein 3D overview. When you get down to it, Wolfenstein 3D has aged and more poorly than Doom due to limitations. That being said, it still manages to have a lot of fun throughout its maps and pleasantly surprised me a number of times. I think it was kind of at its best when it had tight map design that wasn't cheap-shotting you or going for large empty rooms. And let's be real, going toe-to-toe with one of the most infamous men in history in a battle of bullets is more satisfying than any moment in any other Wolfenstein game. It's only sort of a shame that more enemies didn't make use of projectiles. Fake Fuhrer and Shab certainly prove it could be possible in certain situations. At least the enemies were mostly reasonable to fight, with the exception of mutants, because their lack of alert sounds and fire up can rot in the 9th circle.